Thank you. My name is Michael Chisholm, and I'd like, if I may, to pick up John Polkinghorne, your throwaway comment about the agnostic fog. And at this point, I will declare that I'm a lifelong agnostic. My position is fundamentally on the basis that in science there's no absolute certainty, but there are high levels of probability.
Yeah.
On the religious side, there is no high level of certainty, but the probabilities of the existence of God seem to me to be low. But I cannot put them totally out of court. And so that's my fundamental position that I have held for many, many years, and I do not regard it as a fog. And from a personal level, I start from a proposition, do as thou wouldst be done by. And I think from that, one can find most of the commandments and many of the religious rules. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. When I said agnostic fog, I was actually really thinking of Immanuel Kant in relation to science, so that we can know the appearance of things, but we can't know things in themselves. And I reject that. I take a realist view of science. Of course, again, not a total grasp of the physical world. We attain verisimilitude rather than absolute truth. I didn't wish to be offensive in saying agnostic fog, but I do think we gain insights, and I think that it is. I mean, people sometimes say, don't they, scientists doubt everything, which is an absurd thing to say. I mean, we would never get going if we did that. So I think we have to bear. I go back to my old friend Polanyi, commit myself to what I believe to be true, knowing that it might be false. I think that's the human condition, and I think that's how we also live the human condition.
Peter Baker, much modern criticism is levelled at science, that possibly in the biological sciences we're playing God. Does the panel believe that in any area of modern science we are playing God? And are there any limits to science where we should stop because we would be playing God?
Can I say something to that? First of all, I don't very much like the slogan phrase "playing God." I think it is a slogan in that sense. It seems to me the situation, putting it perhaps rather crudely, but it's something like this: science itself, pure science, gives us knowledge, and that seems to me always a gift that's worth having. Knowledge is always a better basis for decision than ignorance would be. But then science's lusty offspring, technology, comes along and turns the knowledge into power, the ability to do things. And that's an ambiguous gift, because not everything that can be done should be done. Hinting that people may get gung-ho and carried away. We've done this, we've done that, come on, let's do the next thing, whatever it may be. You and I both know that scientists are by and large, responsible people and wanting to make ethically right decisions. So we have knowledge, we have power, and we need a third gift, which is wisdom, which is the ability to discern the good and choose it, and the ability to discern the bad and refuse it. And nobody has a monopoly of that. And I think people of goodwill, whether they're an ethical responsibility, whether they're religious believers or not non-believers, need as far as they can to work together in a common search for wise decisions.
Emma Darwin. I come to this as neither a scientist and only very intermittently a believer in God. But what I am is a novelist, and it seems to me that when science and religion are opposed, what are actually being opposed are two different narratives. As the philosopher Richard Kearney says, we are storied creatures. We only understand ourselves and our existence by turning what he calls the bits and pieces of experience into narrative. As a novelist, obviously, I accord myself greater freedom with what I do with those bits and pieces than other narrative forms do. But nonetheless, it seems to me that in both creating science, and I was very interested in your point about science having lately got sort of right down to the kind of bits and pieces layer, and now we're having to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Because it seems to me that what happens is that when the two sides are opposed, people are so bought into their own narrative that everything makes sense that way, that they can't get their heads round a completely separate narrative which also makes sense in its own terms. The other thing I wanted to say is that when you work creatively, one of the things you have to learn to do is to tolerate uncertainty, to be prepared to not know, and to live with that not knowing. And for an awful lot of the world, living with not knowing is extremely worrying. It's very threatening. You don't know when you'll be sorted out, when you'll be okay. And I think that also sometimes is what propels this quest to take everything, but to prove God, to feel that science will solve everything one day, if not now. And perhaps if people were more prepared to stay with the not knowing, I shan't quote this right, and there are probably 50 people in this room who can quote it more accurately than I can, but Charles Darwin did say that the greatest enemy to scientific thought is skepticism. Now that doesn't mean, we should accept any old rubbish, but it does mean that if you do cut yourself off from a willingness to wait and see, you actually miss everything that's important.
Well, I very much agree with almost all of that. I think it's worth suggesting, perhaps in this august company, I don't think science itself really has narratives, but people do construct narratives around science. We, take, for example, the selfish gene. The selfish gene is a very interesting, catchy metaphor, but it is a metaphor, and if it's taken as though it's something that's literally true, as the only aspect of what's going on in evolution, you miss an awful lot that really is happening in evolution and that people are beginning to understand and unravel. But as you say, we are story-making creatures. We need stories in order to understand the world. It's very, very difficult to understand the world in terms solely of equations, possibly impossible. And we need to be very careful that we don't smuggle in these catchy metaphors and imagine that the metaphors themselves are science, because they're a narrative imposed on top of science, and the narrative can be quite seductive and rather misleading.
Well, I think we live in a very rich and complex world, and that gives rise to, as you say, to a whole variety of narratives about the world. And we need all the resources we can gain in that respect. I would give an extremely trite example, which I sometimes use. The kettle is boiling because burning gas heats the water. The kettle's boiling because I want to make a cup of tea, and would you like to have one? Those are two narratives about the same event. And to understand the mysterious event of the boiling kettle, we actually need both of those narratives. And I think that science's narratives and religion's narratives are not directly superposable upon each other, but they have to be consistent with each other. They have to be consonant with each other. If I were to say to you, I intend to make a cup of tea and I've just put the kettle in the refrigerator, that would be a story that wouldn't really make sense. And so I think a lot of the interaction between science and religion, and things we explore in the book, is trying to see the consonants. Science isn't answering religion's questions, religion isn't answering science's questions, but the answers that they give must fit together in some way if it is an account of the one world of complex reality.